in the hours and days after Charlie Kirk's murder. There was discussion on social media about whether this would be America's Reichstag fire. A reference to the fire that was that was a rationale for Hitler's crackdown on political freedom in Germany. Many of us were worried hearing that, and I think what we've seen since suggests the fears were right. But the analogy was wrong. We should have been looking closer to home. This isn't a Reichstag fire. This is more like the Red Scare. We often think of the Red Scare in terms of McCarthyism, named for Joseph McCarthy, its most enthusiastic and effective practitioner. But it was a lot more than that.
Communism. What is it?
The Red Scare's basic structure was to define a political enemy that could not be compromised with.
Who are the apostles of a system that attempts to destroy the American way of life?
The point was to use that charge, that this enemy was everywhere.
That communists have made such an attempt in Hollywood is already evident.
Turning law and order into revolution and into chaos.
That its tentacles had to be chopped off everywhere they could be found, using state power.
The Department of Justice has prosecuted and will continue to prosecute with vigor the actions of subversive groups.
Using cultural power by intimidating employers to go after a very wide swath of your political opponents.
This frame-up attack upon the Communist Party is an attack upon the trade unions and every democratic movement in the United States.
What we are seeing now is a blue scare.
The radicals on the left are the problem.
With God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we have to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people. It will happen, and we will do it in Charlie's name.
We're going to go after the NGO network that foments, facilitates, and engages in violence.
Antifa is going to be designated a domestic terrorist organization.
At least a dozen companies and universities to fire or suspend workers over social media posts.
There's free speech, and then there's hate speech.
But the Red Scare took decades to build. It had at its heart a genuine foreign adversary and real domestic espionage. The Blue Scare isn't being built with the same care or attention or effort at creating political consensus. The Trump administration, as it often does, is speedrunning the project. It took them mere days to get to Jimmy Kimmel. But to see where they might go, we need to look at where America, not all that long ago, was. Corey Robin is a political theorist at Brooklyn College. He's an expert on McCarthyism, as well as the author of the book, The Reactionary Mind, which is, in my opinion, one of the most insightful books you can read on the Trumpist right and what is behind it. As always, my email, EzraKleinShow@nytimes.com. Corey Robin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin here. What was the Red Scare?
There were actually two Red Scares in America. The first one was in 1919, 1920, and that was an intensive government assault on a group of left-wing anarchists, socialists, many of them immigrants, radicals. It was centered around something called the Palmer Raids, during which thousands were arrested and hundreds were deported. The second Red Scare is what we oftentimes call McCarthyism. That was a much longer, far more comprehensive, involving a far greater range of people and ideologies and movements, and I would argue had a much more profound and long-term effect on American political culture.
So let's talk about the first for a second, because the Palmer Raids feel very relevant in this moment. Can you talk about what they were and what triggered them?
Yeah, there was a really intense, but fairly brief episode of political repression, but triggered by this combination of ambient fear and anxiety, rooted in real things, I should say, not just hallucinatory. There was a series of bombings that happened, culminating, on some fairly influential figures. And I think, in fact, there was a bombing attempt or an actual bomb attack on Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General for the Woodrow Wilson administration. And this was coming off of a wave of, fairly intense left-wing activity. There was a fairly robust socialist party. The Bolshevik Revolution had just happened. There were labor unions champing at the bit coming out of World War I. And the government really decided to clamp down upon that and ended up rounding up people, including most famously Emma Goldman, who was deported in something called the Russian Ark. She was on a boat with a bunch of other radicals and just sent back to Russia, where she had been born.
And it gets at something that I have been worried about in this moment, that I see a symmetry with in this moment. But you often have profound periods of repression, of state-sponsored violence that pick up on maybe something people had wanted to do before, but triggered by genuinely real violence, by assassination attempts, by bombing attempts. And that's there in that moment. There is a real act of violence. Yeah. And then a huge ideological project and response.
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue that most political repression has those features that you've just said. I think sometimes people on the left and liberals and centrists tend to treat political repression as if it's purely as I said, a hallucinatory response to fantasized enemies. And that's rarely the case. There are oftentimes real stakes. There can be real acts of violence, as there were. There can be real challenges to the ruling order and the political regime. But you are right that the actors who want to do something about that are oftentimes waiting for what we would call a pretextual moment, and then everything gets thrown in but the kitchen sink as they go after that.
As we get to the second Red Scare, I want to pick up on the way the world changes in between. As you said, the first one is 1919, 1920. That is before World War II. Before, in many ways, communism goes on an international march. I was reading Clay Risen's excellent book, Red Scare, which taught me a lot. And one of the points he makes in that book is that we look back on the Red Scare mainly in the dimensions in which it was a wild overreaction or an act of repression. But to understand it, you have to understand the ways in which communism was alive and growing, and there were actual fronts in America, and there was fears that, there could be takeovers. Try to just give me a little bit of that texture.
Yeah. Communism really was, on the forward march. And particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s, as the battle against fascism got going, communists, played the forefront in that battle. And communists came out of 1945 with a tremendous amount of stature. In fact, I was just reading this wonderful book by Walter Kempowski, German writer, and it's 4 days at the end of World War II, and it's just tremendous. It's based on diaries and memoirs. The love that American soldiers had for Soviet soldiers. I mean, you really feel there had been a real war fought, and there was a real sense of camaraderie between them. So communism had been building, and then also in the United States, as opposed to 1919, where those parties were really much smaller. They were concentrated really in immigrant urban communities. Communism had become, as it was famously said in the 30s and 40s, 20th century Americanism. Communist Party members were part of the federal government, under Roosevelt. Cultural workers became really big parts of Hollywood and the cultural industries. You had some in the universities, and most importantly in the labor unions. And most of these people, I think historians would agree, were just idealistic, progressive, coalitional actors, basically. And they were really, really important part of the New Deal, which is very important for us to understand for what follows. But there were certainly very high-level members of the Communist Party who were also spying for the Soviet Union. And so right there, you immediately have the problem, which is you've got a party and a movement and a group of people that have really become integrated in ways that we would find very hard to imagine today, the mainstream of American life and its culture. And yet part of that party is also allied to what immediately, following 1945 is going to become the big enemy of the United States. And that is a recipe for disaster.
So you have in this period, not the beginnings, but the growing strength of a number of emancipatory movements. You have labor unions. You have the desegregation and civil rights movements. You have a movement for gender equality. You have, in a much more nascent way, a movement for sexual equality, for rights for gay and lesbian men and women. And the communists and socialists are sort of two things at once. There's, on the one hand, just a group of people with a commitment to more left and radical politics, which are braided into these movements for obvious reasons, are actual political allies. And then it's connected, and you have these party structures, some of them explicitly communist parties, some of them fronts, that really are trying to take orders from Moscow. Like, that's not fake. They're trying to do what they think the party in the Soviet Union wants them to do. And it's like in this kind of ambiguity between the two, like the ways that touching a normal political reform movement also might mean touching a movement actually allied to the Soviet Union, that you get like the raw material for what becomes the second Red Scare.
Yeah. I mean, I think before we get to that, which is maybe both more ambiguous but more explosive, what you just said, we also have the question of actual espionage and spying.
This is the other big thing.
And I do think, that's really important because, of course, in many ways, that's the crown jewel of the right wing's attack. And it's the crown jewel because it's real. It's not fake. It's, there were people who were, very closely tied with the Communist Party and the Communist Party who were doing actual, spying and espionage. And
at high levels.
And at very high levels.
I mean, there are nuclear secrets smuggled out of the United States that accelerate the Soviet Union's development of an atomic weapon, which is considered a huge loss in the Cold War.
Absolutely. And also, diplomacy at Yalta. There's people who are fairly high up in the, Roosevelt administration who know about what's going on there, who are also linked with the party and passing secrets. So, it's real stuff. And I think we do a disservice to try to pretend like that wasn't the case because that was part of the tragedy of the whole moment. But then you have what you were just talking about, which is, to what extent is the Communist Party really sort of taking orders from the Soviet Union about its political line? And I think there historians are much more uncertain about how to do that. And I think we have to be really, really careful because there are a lot of times when, the Communist Party is pursuing not just good emancipatory things, but as we would say, really good coalitional politics, really building bridges between different groups. And, sometimes the Soviet Union was in favor of that, sometimes it wasn't. But so there it gets much trickier. And I think the really important thing about this is less for the Red Scare and more just because of the internal division it creates on the left and the internal suspicion and the internal sense of betrayal that you get. Some people feeling when they feel like, wait a minute, when you're speaking to me, are you speaking to me as a good left-winger or are you taking dictation from somebody else? And I think that's where this atmosphere of suspicion and recrimination really becomes very difficult and has some lessons, I think, for us today, not in terms of people taking dictation from a foreign power, but that atmosphere of mutual distrust among people who are allies is poison, and it becomes a real problem and makes you very vulnerable.
Tell me a little bit about Alger Hiss.
Alger Hiss was a kind of very waspy, blue-blooded government official. He had gone to Harvard Law School. I think he had clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice. And he became a fairly high figure in the agriculture department. And he was, in many ways, a representative figure of what we're talking about in D.C. It was a very left-wing city. It had a very left-wing culture. And the Communist Party was a big part of that. And he was part of that milieu and got involved in what became exposed as a spy ring involving a man named Whittaker Chambers, a kind of only in America type of figure, very troubled, very interesting, very mournful figure, and who was the opposite in a way of Hiss. I mean, just as a character study, he was, Hiss was very good looking. He was very suave. He was very tall. He was very slender. Chambers just was a mess, and he looked like a mess. Chambers was a spy, and Hiss passed him a series of papers and for his handlers to take back to the Soviet Union. And I think the significance is less the specifics of what was going on than that this just became, I don't know how you would even describe it today, everything from Charlie Kirk to O.J. Simpson to, it was just a cultural event.
Who's the Liar might well be the title of the drama which unfolds before a packed caucus room where the House Un-American Affairs Committee members swear in Alger Hiss, former State Department executive. Mr. Hiss is accused of being a former communist and before news cameras faces his accuser.
Well, so there's the House Un-American Activities Committee, and you get this, I believe the first televised congressional hearings are this Chambers-Hiss showdown.
Mm-hmm.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
And I've been trying, when you read back into this, it's so hard to put yourself in the mindset of what it all is. The agriculture department is a much bigger deal in that period of American life than it is today. Not that it's a small thing today, but huge. We have way more farmers, right? And Hiss goes on to be a top aide to Dean Acheson, it was top, the absolute elite of the elite foreign policy side of things. It's not quite like if Jake Sullivan or, on the right, maybe Stephen Miller turned out to be a spy for the Chinese Communist Party. It's maybe just one step below that, but it is one step below that.
He was a scion of the American establishment. He really was a figure. And I'm glad you brought up the agriculture department because, Henry Wallace, who ends up being FDR's vice president, comes out of the agriculture department. And so, there's a real sense that he is, from the establishment, but he's part of the American grain, so to speak.
This does a lot of things, I think, but one of the things is it really creates a sense, well, if it could have been him, then you can't discount it being anybody.
Mm-hmm.
What are the tools that are being used in this period of the Red Scare?
There are many, and that's the important thing. So let's just start with that, and this is really a larger lesson about political repression in America, both what's different and what's similar. McCarthyism, that Red Scare, was just not particularly a violent affair. There were not really that many people, comparatively speaking, who went to jail. There were not that many people who were deported, if you compare it to the first Red Scare. But what you did have is roughly 20 to 40% of the American workforce subject to surveillance, investigations, and firings for their beliefs and activities. And I just want to say something because I think when people, and I'm glad we're using the language of the Red Scare as opposed to McCarthyism, because, when we say McCarthyism, people really think about Joe McCarthy. He comes on the scene, nobody's ever even heard of him really until 1950. The Red Scare happens much earlier. It really starts in 1946, and it is comprehensive. First and foremost, I think at the level of the government, you have to look at the FBI. As it turns out, the FBI was majorly gathering surveillance and information and then passing it up the food chain. And so it then goes to higher levels of the executive branch. And that leads to the second dimension of the Red Scare, which is the purge of the civil service. It begins in around 1947. And, we're not talking about figures like Hiss. We're really talking about people who work in Washington, really, in the post office, and in a whole range of, the government's gotten big, and are members of the Communist Party. Carl Bernstein's father, the great journalist, his parents were communists, and the government starts getting rid of them as a security threat and there's hearings and there's a bureaucracy. It's not just random and arbitrary terror, which is an important thing to emphasize. It's a very bureaucratic procedural mechanism, but it really doesn't just get rid of around, I think, 10,000 members of the civil service, but also is, just really creates an atmosphere. Just, think of what happened recently with Doge. Not nearly as scattershot, but, it has a chilling effect. So that's the second part. Then you have congressional hearings, which we've just already alluded to, but there's HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities Committee. There's McCarthy's committee and several other committees in the Senate. These are very high-profile media publicity events where they're getting fed information from the FBI, often confidential information, where you can't confront your accuser because it's not a court of law, but it is a court of public opinion. And that then, and this gets us now to another level of McCarthyism, how you perform what you do before these hearings, if you're testifying, goes then to your employer. And this becomes, very famous in Hollywood by people who are either willing to testify, are not willing to testify, are willing to testify about themselves, are not willing to name names about other people. There's a whole thing there. And employers start firing people who are suspect. I've just talked about maybe 1/10 of what the Red Scare was. But it's important.
But let me hold on the 10th for a minute, because there's
Sure.
something about the Hollywood dimension of it that I think is important and is important for thinking about now.
The question before this committee and the scope of its present inquiry will be to determine the extent of communist infiltration in the Hollywood motion picture industry.
So you have this group of screenwriters that is called up, and screenwriters in Hollywood at this time are probably the most left-wing of the Hollywood machine. Yeah.
Your purpose is to use this to disrupt the motion picture industry, to invade the right not only of me, but of the producers to their thoughts, to their opinions.
Contempt citations and ejection from the hearings came in rapid succession.
It's very apparent that you're following the same line of these other witnesses.
I am following no line.
Which is definitely the communist line.
I am using my own head, which I shall continue to do.
You're excused, and if you want to make a speech, go out here under one of the big trees and sound off.
And some of them, were involved in communist or communist front organizations. Some of them are kind of just more left-wing. But they're a big cause celeb, and Hollywood rallies around them. And it's pretty amazing in retrospect how quickly Hollywood, with all of its cultural power, falls.
Yeah.
They have these hearings, they're kind of a fiasco. And the, Motion Picture Association of America, or possibly it's, whatever it's called then, basically agrees to, a kind of soft blacklist, to codes of what sort of movies can get released. Ayn Rand writes a guide to what should be in movies. You shouldn't be, valorizing the working man.
Right.
And it reshapes the content of movies. I think this is like one of the very scary parts. They don't pass a law telling Hollywood what to do.
Right.
Right? They go after a couple of screenwriters, and then Hollywood collapses.
And the thing about that self-censorship is, over time, as anybody who's ever been in an institution knows, you do things initially under kind of this threat of coercion, And then over time, you start inhabiting the role. In Hollywood, I think you just see a version of this very much writ large. There was, a kind of very high-profile set of hearings, and just to put some meat on those bones about how Hollywood rallies on behalf of these many communist screenwriters, they form something called the Committee on the First Amendment, and they go to D.C., and it's people like Gene Kelly, Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, and there's a beautiful picture of them marching on the Capitol. We stand for American values. We're the true patriots. We believe in the First Amendment. And then, as you say, very quickly, Hollywood crumbles. The mobilization it just fails. And the people with economic power in Hollywood just start getting very, very nervous. There are these kind of freelance forces out there. There's a famous grocer, the grocer from Syracuse, who is, he won't put products on his shelves if he finds out that the networks or other, kind of cultural things are putting advertisements for those products. There's a kind of reverberation that just starts extending out there where people feel like there's going to be some real economic bottom line consequences if we pursue this route. For me, the heartbreaking sort of icing on the top of that cake is Humphrey Bogart, who rallied to defend the First Amendment, who we all know because of Casablanca, right? The great hero of independent, nobody, not the Nazis, are going to push me around. And he's told by Ed Sullivan, who's a really good friend of his, what you did there in D.C., it's not going over well. You're losing your audience share, whatever the metrics are. And he gives an interview, a very famous interview, I think it was with Look magazine. And he says, I don't know what I was doing. I'm a dope. Let the big shots handle that. I'm just an ordinary schmo kind of a thing. It's just the exact opposite. And, ends his career with that hanging over him. So, that's, and as you said, this is all very fast. But there are a lot of little steps, as we've seen in the last couple of days, that can happen within 24 hours. I mean, back then it was probably, a couple of months, but very fast turnaround.
Can you give me some examples of how that changed Hollywood? What are the kinds of movies it made before that it didn't make, after, or the kinds of themes it got that got dropped? Like, how did that actually change the culture people consumed?
Sure. You have some, more overtly political films in the early 1940s. Grapes of Wrath.
I'm right here to tell you, mister, there ain't nobody gonna push me off my land. My grandpa took up this land 70 years ago. My pa was born here. We was all born on it. And some of us was killed on it.
Sort of social justice-y films. And A Gentleman's Agreement about anti-Semitism.
Well, face me now, Miss Wales. Come on, look at me. Same face, same eyes, same nose, same suit, same everything. Here, take my hand. Feel it. Same flesh as yours, isn't it?
There was all these social theme films. Even, screwball comedy, you could say, which was, a lot of it was done by people like Ring Lardner, who were, communists, had a kind of strong social content, and a lot of that kind of disappears. And then you get, like How to Marry a Millionaire, which is a wonderful movie, but very different.
If you had your choice of everybody in the world, which would you rather marry? A rich guy or a poor one?
I think I'd rather marry a rich one.
You still have some wonderful films, but I think the great films, there's an inward turn, this kind of more psychological interiority at the exclusion of the social. And then you also have just, the kind of the embrace of sort of fluff and,
We've sort of kept Joseph McCarthy lurking on the edge of this conversation. Tell me about him.
He was a senator from Wisconsin, a Republican senator. He had been, I think, a bit of I wouldn't say a war hero, but he had fought in the Second World War, and he is elected in the wake of the Second World War. This is kind of a return moment for the Republican Party. They had been really kept out of Congress from 1932 to 1946. They take back the House, and he gets elected to the Senate. And he, in 1950, makes this famous speech at Wheeling, West Virginia, where he says that he has in his hands a list of, and I think the first number, the numbers keep changing, but it was 205 card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the State Department.
Can I note one thing?
Sure.
That I had not understood, and again, I'm taking this from Clay Risen's book, but that in 1948, Truman unexpectedly beats Thomas Dewey, and Truman had been quite unpopular. He was a bad underdog going into that election. And the Republican Party's lesson from that is Dewey did not use anti-communism as an issue.
Yeah.
And that the sort of power structure of the Republican Party prior to McCarthy sort of emerging in this way has taken the lesson that we are not going to make that mistake again.
Yeah.
We are going to beat the hell out of the Democrats on communism. And so the Republican Party was ready for McCarthyism.
Yeah. Thomas Dewey represented a kind of internationalist, wing of—
Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
Well, genteel republicanism.
I would say even far more liberal than, Mitt Romney, actually.
I just mean in the sense that one of the lessons they take from him is that we tried playing it nicely.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so someone like McCarthy in 1950 is a very successful practitioner of putting the Democrats on their heels. And the important thing to remember about McCarthy is that the Republican Party needed him, they wanted him, and they used him. Because there were some Republicans who stood up to him, Margaret Chase Smith most famously. But he was very, very useful to the party. He immediately got out on the stump during the 1950 midterm elections, and there was a big faction of the Republican Party, including the minority leader. We're not talking about a kind of radical right-wing faction, but the center of the party that really depended upon him, for electoral purposes and just for framing the attack, for putting the Democrats on their back feet. But the important thing I just wanted to stress was that between that 1946 and 1950, the Democrats, anti-communism was a Democratic issue. So there are a lot of institutions that are aligned with the Democratic Party that have been engaged with this. And then suddenly McCarthy emerges and finds a way of turning what they had been doing into their vulnerability.
I think this is so important, and I think it's a really hard thing to throw your mind back into because the parties aren't polarized and ideologically distinct in the way they are today. And so even McCarthy, Joseph Kennedy Jr. is a major McCarthy supporter. McCarthy spends many, many weekends at the Kennedy compound. Robert F. Kennedy is on McCarthy's staff. Mm-hmm. The House Committee on Un-American Activities is at times led by a Democratic chairman. And so you have both. You have liberal Republicans who actually do challenge McCarthy and end up in, backwaters or in trouble for it. You do have liberal Democrats who often lose in challenging McCarthy. They lose primaries, they lose elections. But it's not highly structured as a Republican-Democratic issue in the way things typically are now.
Absolutely. I mean, you alluded to this, but of course, Southern Democrats were a big part of the Red Scare, and if I could just bring in an additional element of that, and you ask why were they so anti-communist? Well, of course, the Communist Party and left-wing unions had really made it a project starting in the 1930s, and in fact, FDR supports this. He in 1938. Goes to the South because they believe that until we organize the South with labor unions and the right to vote for African Americans, we can't complete the New Deal. It's just going to be stillborn. This is a very high-level project, and you need organizers to do this. And there are these organizers who go in and, Southern Democrats, do not like this. And so this isn't just, as we're saying, it's not just a partisan kind of a thing. It really goes to the heart of a social cleavage in a big part of the country. And there are real stakes for both sides in winning that battle.
This seems also to get at a reason this becomes so uniting on the right, that, and I mean here the ideological right, not just the Republican Party, that there's an effort to paint every social movement they don't like, and this goes back to this ambiguity, as a communist plot to take over America. Racial integration, communist plot to take over America. Labor unions and the sort of elevation of the working man, a communist plot. Gender equality, sexual equality, a communist plot. And so you have a lot of purges of people who their real sin is working on behalf of these issues that today we look back on as obvious, just the emancipatory path of American politics, the arc bending towards justice.
Right.
But people lose their jobs. People are investigated, based on, the effort to paint all of these as communist plots.
There was a woman named Dorothy Bailey who was a government worker, I think in the post office, a black woman. And she has to go through an investigation. She's named as a communist. And she's asked a bunch of questions. One of the questions she is asked is, do you believe in desegregating the blood supply of the Red Cross? And I remember when I was in my first year of graduate school or second year of graduate school reading this, just very naive and thinking, what in the world are they talking about? It's 1950, 1951. The battle over desegregation is on and about to get much, much bigger. And you have something called the one-drop rule in this country that says you're black if you have one drop of blood. The last thing you want to do if you believe in all of those things is to have blood from a black person going into the bloodstream of a white person. And the Communist Party, as part of its organizing, very wisely, picked this as a battle because it's so outrageous. And so the irony that's very hard, it's for me to get my head wrapped around, is that then becomes a question that you're asked by a government or an employee, private inquisitor. And you say, why are they asked that question? Well, because many people will deny that they're part of the Communist Party, or they'll say they're no longer part of the Communist Party. And then the question is, well, how do you determine, are they really a communist or not? And it's, what they call this the duck test. If it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And it just begins to get at, I think, not just the moral dimension of all of this, but just really the cultural politics. I mean, just you can think of a range of issues now that we just completely take for granted that we're part of this left-wing front of like moral common sense. Like this is what good people believe in. And it was very present in Hollywood. It was very present in parts of the academy. It was very present in the parts of the media. And it goes back to that point you made at the very beginning, which is this wasn't a hallucination, on their part. Like there were communists. They were involved in these ideas. There were liberals allied with them. The ground between them was kind of murky. And you had conservative Democrats and Republicans who, for both material and ideological reasons and electoral reasons, hated it. And it was really a kind of a civil war.
In today's super competitive business environment, the edge goes to those who push harder, move faster, and level up every tool in their arsenal. T-Mobile knows all about that. They're now the best network according to the experts at Ookla Speed Test, and they're using that network to launch Super Mobile, the first and only business plan to combine intelligent performance, built-in security, and seamless satellite coverage. That's your business supercharged. Learn more at supermobile.com. Seamless coverage with compatible device in most outdoor areas in the U.S. where you can see the sky. Best network based on analysis by Ookla Speed Test Intelligence Data 1H 2025.
Tell me about the Lavender Scare.
So in the 1930s with the New Deal, you had the arrival in D.C. D.C. had always been a kind of gay city. It was a place where gays and lesbians could kind of exist. But particularly with the New Deal, you have people coming from all across the country. And many of them joined the administration. And also you have, and this is a really important part of this, a lot of women coming to D.C. and starting to get positions of power in the government, most famously Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. But there were many, many people, beneath her. And Eleanor Roosevelt is kind of a fixture in this community. And so they create a culture that is associated with the New Deal of increasing gender equality, or at least increasing representation of women in public spaces and political spaces, and also increasing gay, I wouldn't kind of say public culture, but, kind of a subculture that was a part of it. There's one other backstory here, which is in espionage circles or in counter-espionage circles, always finding out if somebody was gay. Was a really good weapon to know because you could use it as blackmail. And it's suddenly, the security apparatus, long before McCarthy and all those guys, wants to make sure that they know people's sexual orientation because, if they're gay, they're vulnerable to spying for the Soviet Union. So there's elaborate bureaucracy that's created around this. But then as we get closer to McCarthy, you see hints of this in Alger Hiss. There is this notion that these guys who are commies and liberals and pinkos, they're queer. Dean Acheson with his fancy pants and his, mustache, he's a little bit too concerned about how he looks and his clothes. And it has tremendously devastating consequences. What had been a kind of limited security espionage thing becomes a real purge of government. And it really gets going after 1950. So at that point, I think the statistic, if I'm remembering this correctly, is that, every day, a communist is being arrested or kicked out of the government, but also a gay person is being kicked out of government. This is what blew me away. McCarthy's fan mail, 25% of it was about security threats. 75% of it was about sexual depravity, what they called sexual depravity. This was a big part.
And I think one of the things I'm trying to draw out in all of this is that you end up with this amorphous omnithreat. Communism is its heart, but maybe it's gay people in government and the sort of sexual and gender revolution that is speaking about or signaling. Maybe it's racial integration, labor unions, maybe it's the New Deal itself, but the turning of it all into a plot, a threat, a kind of insidious force that can be used to corrupt any other part of it.
Yeah.
I think it's very core to the politics of that. And also, as best I can tell, very core to how it maintains momentum because it's hard to find all these communists. There actually aren't that many of them. Right. So McCarthy begins to go after gay people, right? Like you can kind of keep changing the subject and things are linked to each other.
Yeah.
Even if they're not actually the same or those links aren't even important.
Yeah. What was going on there in the sort of Red Scare imagination, let's say, is the conversion of politics into plot, conspiratorial plot. And I think it's really important to put both of those pieces together the way you just did, because I think oftentimes when we look back on this, it's easy to say, well, I'm not a conspiracy thinker. I'm against conspiracies. I don't think like that, and so on and so forth. But what makes conspiracies powerful, particularly in a moment like that, is it's not making shit up. Yes, it's cartoonish, and yes, it's simplifying, but it has real raw material to work with. And of course, for the people who are battling that Red Scare and pursuing it, it also gives them a sense of, if we could get to the heart of that plot, we can stop all this. We can, it's like Archimedes' lever, you can really give me a lever and I'll move the world, and we just have to find that. And, you see that in everybody from J. Edgar Hoover. He makes a very famous statement about how during the Bolshevik Revolution, people say, oh, the Communist Party, there's only X number. And he said, well, look at the numbers during the Bolshevik Revolution. It wasn't, that different. And there's just a real sense.
Not wrong, actually.
Yeah. But it's not true in terms of, it's not a plot.
Yes.
That's not true. That's not the way it worked. Would that, I think for many leftists, would that it were so easy.
Yeah.
But it's not completely wrong either. And,
I think that's a good place to move closer to the present. So let's start before Charlie Kirk is assassinated. Trump wins his second term. He takes office. What that you had been watching, seeing in the ideological structure of Trumpism or the methods that Trumpism was applying to unfriendly institutions and movements echoed this? How were you telling that story to yourself as somebody so steeped in the Red Scare?
Let me first start by saying that during the first Trump term, I was part of a fairly small group of people on the left who were very skeptical of a lot of the warnings about authoritarianism, fascism, autocracy, strongman politics. And I think I had a lot of evidence on my side. I wasn't just being ornery. There was many, many ways in which I thought, compared to, say, George W. Bush, if we're thinking about political repression, if we're thinking about transforming institutions, that Trump was actually, quite a peddling kind of actor. I know the second Red Scare. I know the labor wars in this country. I know about the battle over abolition. It seemed like Trump was small potatoes, not just because of the ways in which he was constrained. It also seemed like, well, what was the revolution that it was sort of counteracting? I mean, you had nothing like the New Deal. You had nothing like, what we've just been describing. So I was skeptical. And what shook me out of this was the assault on government workers and the firings. That was the first thing. For me, that's always the canary in the coal mine is employment sanctions. There's a long history of it. It's really the way a lot of American political repression has happened. W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, this very violent moment against Black people, says it's employment sanctions that really is the driving engine. So anybody with that kind of antenna, you didn't see that really in the first term. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Civil society rallied against Trump, resisted in all these ways. And then all of a sudden you see these mass firings happening. There's all kinds of reasons to worry about that. But I was thinking about it instantaneously as McCarthyism because of the firing. The other thing then was, of course, the capitulation of law firms and universities. And, the record of elites and institutions, unfortunately, is not so great. And so seeing those institutions start capitulating, and often capitulating to financial threats, economic threats, not we're going to put you in jail, but, we're going to take away your funding. We're going to do this and you do that. And I think, Americans have a weird attitude towards money. On the one hand, it's the most important thing in America. And on the other hand, we have this very moralistic idea, well, if it's just money, stand up to the bastards. And it's like, could we put these two worlds together? The economy is a medium of political coercion in this country. It always has been. Trump didn't invent that.
I want to pick up on something you said because it speaks to your book, The Reactionary Mind, which I love, have read twice. I think it describes second-term Trump much better than first-term Trump. One of your big points in The Reactionary Mind is that we often think of conservatism as conserving, but it's also a movement that reacts to threats to power and to the social order. And you said something there that one reason you took first-term Trump less seriously as a threat was that there wasn't a revolutionary emancipatory movement that was really in reaction against, or at least as you saw it. I would say between 2016 and 2024, that at least at a cultural level changes. You have sort of a racial reckoning, not only, but particularly after George Floyd's murder. You have the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
You have a big move on gender expression and gender rights around trans issues in particular. You have, I actually think COVID and the professional classes are somehow very relevant here. The sense that cultural power is being exerted there. So that's actually a lot of something to react against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And Trump comes back to office with a very different coalition, a coalition that now includes Elon Musk, includes much of Silicon Valley and the tech platforms, the people in charge of them, that includes a very big gender backlash behind it, that includes the comedians like Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn, and the sort of centers of power that they're cultural, that are, atmospheric, that actually have a lot of money, that have control of attention, includes RFK Jr. and his coalition, which is not insignificant. I mean, Trump's 2024 election, he has a much higher share of the black vote, and particularly black men, than he did in 2016. He does very well among Hispanic voters. And the social order becomes very liquid in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think we spent a lot of time in the first Trump administration, or I certainly did, and I would say to people, what is it? And people talk about demographic change and so on, but I kept saying, one of the big things was racial equality.
That's what I thought it was.
Yeah.
Demographic change.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's not that doesn't create some anxiety. Of course it does. But again, historically speaking, those weren't it wasn't just demographic change. You needed something more than that. And also, I was thinking on racial equality, the metrics were actually going the other way. So it was like the right had won that battle. Neighborhoods were more deep.
Although they didn't feel that way around Obama.
It's true that they didn't feel that way. And I think, but I don't think that matters as much, because I think the reality was, they might not have felt that way, but they weren't able to do much with the feeling that they had. They needed some raw material to work with. And I think you've just begun to, lay out some of the raw material that they began to get between 2016 and 2024. And the thing that really concretized this for me, that kind of brought it all together, there was an interview. God, I always forget his name. He's from Silicon Valley. Andreessen.
Mark Andreessen.
Yeah, in the New York Times. It was
with my colleague Ross Douthat.
Yeah, it was an excellent interview. And he talks about what it was like to have his employees start coming back to work after the initial shutdown.
So COVID was a giant radicalizing moment. And then by that point, we had lived through 8 years of what was sort of increasingly clearly a social revolution, like very clearly like companies basically being hijacked to be engines of social change, social revolution. The employee base is going feral. There were cases in the Trump era. There were multiple companies I know that felt like they were hours away from full-blown violent riots on their own campuses by their own employees.
He was like a father whose teenage kids were rebelling against him. And
he talks about at the companies where he knew the CEOs very well and he was invested, feeling like on any given day the employees might riot, I think was the term he used.
Yeah. And, they're speaking up. They're demanding different
hours. I should have brought this into that initial list, because I think the feeling among many of these people that you're having all of a sudden the employees had all the power, right? They were getting people fired. They were demanding the workplaces made political statements.
Yeah.
Like, who was really in charge here?
Who was in charge? Any union organizer will always tell you the fundamental battle in any union drive is not about the profit, bottom line. It's who's in charge of the workplace. And there was, and I think what's important about all this is that it brings all these cultural issues, because a lot of these younger employees were talking about trans rights. They were talking about Me Too. They were talking about Black Lives Matter. So those aren't just, floaters out there in the culture. They're embodied in workers who are fighting with you about, the direction of the workplace. And, for any employer, when that starts happening, your mind starts racing very, very fast. And again, this is kind of similar to the anti-communism thing that we were just talking about, because it's not just fantasy on the part of an employer that, we could be losing control. They sometimes are losing control. And, that has implications for all sorts of things.
You have a whole thing that conservatism correctly understands the reality of political loss.
Yeah.
And stature loss. That conservatives are often right that they are losing things.
Yeah. and I think this is something the left and liberals and centrists, everybody has a very hard time coming to terms with this. We'd like to think that these people are just crazy, that they're just making stuff up, that they're liars, that they're all these things. But the truth of the matter is, it's kind of hard to create a politically repressive social movement out of nothing. And there were some real, I wouldn't say they were as fundamental as some of the stuff we saw in the 1930s or the 40s or in the 60s and 70s. But, there were tremors, let's say. Another thing that Paul Krugman just wrote about recently is, in terms of gender equality, it's not so much that women entering the workforce, that's been going on. I mean, first of all, Black women, and women of color have been in the workforce forever. But in the 40s, you do see increasing numbers of women coming into the workforce. But starting in the 80s and 90s, you see women, younger women increasingly looking for careers. It's the kinds of jobs that they're looking for. They're looking for jobs that white men have traditionally had. CEOs, professors, filmmakers, the whole, editors of the New York Times, the whole 9 yards. It gets very zero-sum very fast. And so, yeah, I do think that conservatives understand this. And, people on the left either don't understand it or try to pretend it away. And you're sort of entering into a war, kind of disarming yourself. You just don't quite understand the stakes.
You're denying the other side's subjective reality out of which they will power their politics. One thing I have the experience I think that many people on the left do, where I hear some of these complaints and I think they're ridiculous. But the level of radicalization around feeling that Twitter was not giving your work enough promotion, that, you weren't allowed to spread what certainly seemed to many and many experts to be vaccine misinformation, right? That there was actually much more the sort of raw material of the movies are all diverse now. We're going to make Thor in Marvel Comics into a woman. We're going to make Captain America into a black man. Like, who cares? It's a comic book. People care.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it is wrong to do that. I want to be very clear, but it is motivating to do that. You have a line in The Reactionary Mind where you say, quote, conservatives often are the left's best students. Tell me about that.
I started teaching about conservatism in, the first or second Bush administration, just started reading these texts. And one of the things that shocked me, and I started with Edmund Burke, the father of the whole thing, was all the times in which he hates the Jacobins, he hates the French Revolution, he hates all of it. But he says over and over and over again, in their commitment, in their fidelity, in their vision, in their execution, there are superiors. And there is a real kind of grudging respect for what this rabble has been able to accomplish. And over the years, you see this recur throughout the history, you see increasingly elaborate attempts to learn from the left. Now, sometimes this is very kind of strategic and instrumental. Let's, he just recently died, David Horowitz, who'd been on the left and then moved to the right. And he was a big activist against universities. And he said, let's just use all the language the left on the campus is using and just turn it against them. Say, you're the ones engaging in hate speech. You're doing this. You're doing that. So, and he was very cynical and open about it.
I mean, you read Christopher Rufo, and he's very explicit about being a student of what he believes the left does. Stephen Miller, in a different way, the same thing. There's been this move in the past couple of months to say, aren't you all the big proponents of free speech? Didn't you just run as opponents of cancel culture and say that you would defend our rights to say anything? And there's been this effort to tag the right with hypocrisy, which, to be fair, it's very hypocritical. That's, a fair play. But I think it actually misses, in a way, what's going on. Like, I think they consciously understand themselves as having learned from what they think the left did when they feel the left had control of cultural institutions, canceling people for things they said, sending like online mobs against them, shadow banning them, moderating them, using money through Title IX and other things to push universities ideologically. And now they are supercharging it. Mm-hmm. And I am not, I want to be clear that I am not absolving them of their responsibility for this or saying this is the left's fault, but I do think there is something here in I really believe that what they understand themselves as doing is a kind of hypercharged turnabout. Mm-hmm. And that in some ways we're in a weaker position because if we can charge them with hypocrisy, they can charge us with hypocrisy.
Yeah. I would like to move it out of the moral register because I think you're making a really important point that everybody needs to understand, but that sometimes the language of hypocrisy kind of—
Yeah, I agree with you.
But let's just start with a point that I think a lot of the best historians of McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare make, which was that a certain part of the apparatus that had developed and was used against the Communist Party was developed by the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was beloved by the Roosevelt administration, who used him to go after its partisan enemies, but also whatever threat there was perceived to be of Nazi saboteurs and allies with the Nazis and so forth. And it's not a question of turnabout is fair play. It's just— governments, I mean, you know this, you're a student of the administrative state. Like, you build these bureaucracies, they don't just go away. And, bureaucrats are trained. And so that's the first thing is that a bureaucracy has been built over the years, in part by the Democratic Party, by liberal groups and so forth in universities. That it was just a matter of time that would be turned against them. And I think there were some people on the left who were warning about this from the beginning, and they were not listened to. If the most dramatic turnaround from everything, and I feel it very much at the level of rhetoric, and I've seen this on campuses, I've seen this among students, is the use of, if you are a critic of Israel, if you are opposed to the state of Israel, if you're an anti-Zionist, you're engaging in a form of hate speech. And I've had conversations with students who will say quite sincerely, and many of them had been, and probably still are, kind of progressive, Obama, Kamala Harris types, but very committed to the state of Israel. And that weaponized language of victim identity, hate speech, which, was very popular, potent, and powerful on the left, that speech is a form of harm, right? Which in certain instances, it can be. I want to be clear on that. But, just the assumption that people say things that make me uncomfortable, that I find offensive, and so on and so forth, that was, I think, probably in the last 2 years was, if you want to look at, just politically potent, explosive moments where you're seeing the writing on the wall, that to me was it, because university administrators really were caught kind of with their pants, like they put their pants down, like they didn't know how to react to this because they were so steeped in that language themselves. They had no way. And suddenly you have kids who are expelled, students who are expelled, faculty who are being investigated. And, the truth of the matter is, calling for the, destruction, just calling for it, saying, I believe in this, is not a violation of it's protected speech.
So some of the things that you were just talking about them doing, the universities, they justified their crackdown in terms of anti-Semitism, always a very strange rationale for what they were doing.
Yeah.
But I think when he comes into office with this new coalition, it doesn't have what we were talking about a minute ago, which was an omnithreat. Mm-hmm. Doge was justified as efficiency, right? As if it were the reincarnation of reinventing government from the Bill Clinton administration. And there were, you can go watch panels of people on the right saying, no, we have to be honest. This is about ideology. We're trying to take back the administrative state, but it was justified in terms of efficiency and saving money. Yeah. You have the attack on the law firms, which isn't really justified by any big argument at all. They just do it. Mm-hmm. Attack on media outlets is more justified by a sense of bias and attacks on Donald Trump. There isn't a thing uniting it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't exactly that it was slowing down, but I would say a month ago, 2 months ago, my sense of it was that as bad as it wasn't quite holding together.
Mm-hmm.
And then Charlie Kirk was assassinated.
Yeah.
And I guess, well, let me ask you this. How have you seen them change what they are saying, what they are doing in the aftermath of that?
Yeah. So I think at the level of words, which I'm usually a little skeptical of, but I think in this instance matter, you see the emergence of vengeance as a language. And vengeance is an old language, goes back to the ancient Greeks and the Bible. And it's a very dangerous language. And there's a reason why the Greeks were terrified of it. Because, put it this way, it has a licensing structure that is extraordinarily permissive, on the one hand. But on the other hand, and this is almost a paradox, it has a very stern injunction, moral injunction at the heart of it. You have to take revenge for this loss, and if you don't, it's as if you're committing a second murder yourself. You're not honoring this person. And this is, it's a really terrifying language. It's not one that's monopolized by the right. There was a wonderful historian, Arno Mehr, who wrote a wonderful book about the French and the Russian Revolution, where he talks about, it's called The Furies, actually, after the ancient Greek gods, about the role of vengeance on the left. And it is absolutely terrifying, this sort of holy violence that it seems to authorize, where people are morally empowered to do horrible things that they wouldn't ordinarily feel themselves authorized to do. So just before I came over here, I looked, the Chronicle of Higher Education is just keeping track of how many people have been fired, faculty and jobs, since the Charlie Kirk murder, and because of that.
And just one industry.
And one industry, and voluntary. These are decisions of employers that are just doing this. And these, in an industry, by the way, where you have the most protection of any work, more protection than you have, Ezra Klein, with tenure and often, union rights and so forth. It's Hannah Arendt wrote a letter to her mentor, Karl Jaspers, in the middle of the McCarthy era. And she said, everything melts like butter under the sun. And what she meant was the collapse of the institutions and the leaders of the institutions, of people who, as you were saying about Hollywood, just the day before sounded a little bit more robust. And I've just, this murder has galvanized the right for reasons that, like the second Red Scare, are both strategic and sincere, and you can see it. And it feels like they're just getting started.
In today's super competitive business environment, the edge goes to those who push harder, move faster, and level up every tool in their arsenal. T-Mobile knows all about that. They're now the best network according to the experts at Ookla Speed Test, and they're using that network to launch Super Mobile, the first and only business plan to combine intelligent performance, built-in security, and seamless satellite coverage. That's your business supercharged. Learn more at supermobile.com. Seamless coverage with compatible device in most outdoor areas in the U.S. where you can see the sky. Best network based on analysis by Ookla Speed Test Intelligence Data 1H 2025.
I want to play you a clip of Stephen Miller, whose deputy chief of staff was close to Charlie Kirk and seems as much as anybody to be sort of structuring the response here.
With God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout this government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people. It will happen, and we will do it in Charlie's name.
These networks is the term I want to zoom in on there. In that same episode, Vance talks about the Ford Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, The Nation magazine. Charlie Kirk was murdered by, as best we know, a single gunman making a very, very, very terrible decision. But what I see happening is an effort to blow this up into a kind of omnithreat. There is this thing called the radical left. It's not just this crazy guy in Utah. It's all the NGOs that support liberal or left-wing causes. It's anybody who, through, the Soros Foundation has supported liberal judges. It's an effort to turn, and I guess the argument is they created a climate in which this guy got radicalized. But the effort to expand this, to create your threat that links it all together, and then, crack down on that threat, that feels to me like where we're entering into I've been thinking about it as a blue scare, right? That feels to me like the symmetry here, the size of the enemy, which I think is something they sort of thought before, right? They didn't just learn about, I think bringing in the Ford Foundation is ridiculous, but they've been talking about the NGO network for a long time, right? But now they have their reason to go after it.
I want to read to you the language of the Smith Act, which was the kind of the major legislative tool that was used against the left during the McCarthy era. This was the way you could bring people up on criminal charges. What was criminal was conspiring with someone else to organize a party or a group. Conspiring with someone to organize a party or a group to advocate, teach, or encourage the desirability of the overthrow of the government by force or violence. What do you notice there? You notice the number of nouns and verbs you have to get to before you get to violence, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's very relevant to what you just said. It is the identification of a network that can be tied in any way, shape, or form to acts of violence. The flip side of this, which the journalist Ken Klipperstein just posted about, is also that they've come up with a new formula for the lone gunman type, which is nihilistic violent extremists. Nihilistic is an interesting word choice because it's kind of like anything and everything. So on the one hand, they're identifying this network to go after a whole apparatus that they both believe and, don't, and some of them opportunistically believe, but then also this very free-floating signifier of the kinds of individuals who might engage in violent extremism.
Yeah, so the idea is there is no such thing as the individual. That the individual is the product of a climate.
Everybody's a vector.
Everybody's a vector. And so, if you're an organization, who's anybody who works at it or, who maybe now said anything that is disrespectful to Charlie Kirk or talked about things that you think are the kind of thing that the shooter could have believed, they become fair game.
Absolutely. And again, the thing that the president and I would look to is, it oftentimes start with the employer investigating their own personnel. And those investigations then become a kind of raw database for the authorities. But you can see how in an environment like this, that archive becomes fair game for the Trump administration to demand handing it over, sharing it with other actors. To me, it's the elaborate infrastructure, the meeting of rhetoric and institutions and law and the state. That, to me, is what we're seeing.
I think that's right. And then I think what we're seeing is the connecting that to state power.
Yeah.
In a way, the left, I think whatever the right thinks of it, really did not.
Yeah.
And did not do in this way. There is you just saw it with the Jimmy Kimmel thing.
Yeah.
Which feels very Red Scare to me.
Yeah.
And comes from the head of the FCC.
Yeah.
Functionally threatening to use the FCC's power to block a merger.
Yeah.
The federal government has a lot of discretionary power reaching all across the economy. It funds universities, it approves or disapproves of mergers, it regulates different players, it has all kinds of authorities to ask for information. It can do, if it begins to unleash itself from, procedural neutrality.
Yeah.
There's very little it can't touch. And so what they seem to me to be doing is they've been building for some time, really since coming into their second term. They came in and said, the cultural institutions, the various institutions of society were turned against us. This is what Project 2025 is largely about. We are going to use the state to bring them to heel. We're going to break them. And they were doing that to greater and lesser degrees of effectiveness. But they didn't really have a story.
Mm-hmm.
And what they have now is a story mixed with like the genuine energy of vengeance, right? They did know him. They are really furious. Trump almost was killed by a different assassin's bullet. And so I think the mixture of, genuine sincerity, fury, and a pre-existing ideological project that they had been very, very, very systematically figuring out what leverage the federal government has and how they could use it, often in very novel ways. That's coming together now into something new. And I think is bringing us into a new era. Pam Bondi saying, she had to walk this back a little bit, but Pam Bondi saying, the Attorney General, hate speech isn't protected by the Constitution. We're in something new here, like a very fractured mirror of the previous era, but now deployed by a state trying to crush the network that it understands to be its political enemy.
Yeah. Nancy Mace, the congresswoman from South Carolina, after the murder of Charlie Kirk said, we don't fund hate, we fire it. We fire hate. And, you talk about they have about a narrative. You couldn't come up with a more pithy narrative. They're not just going to fire people over this, although they are going to do that. But, they want to, crush the institutions that they claim, as you say, fostered this environment. They have a martyr. They have a cause célèbre. It's interesting you brought up Trump about his almost being assassinated, because it almost seems like he was more moved by what happened to Charlie Kirk than what happened to him. But it's become emblematic. He's a figure, and you see this throughout the history of both right and left wing movements. They have their martyrs.
I think Trump felt less vulnerable in a strange way after the near assassination of him. I think it scared him. I think it shook him.
Yeah.
But I also think he came out with this, I am chosen by God. I am touched. I am marked.
Yeah.
And Kirk's killing made them all feel vulnerable.
Yeah. 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 And,
vulnerability is a very scary emotion.
Justice Jackson, great Justice Robert Jackson, who's a New Deal Supreme Court appointee, and he was also the prosecutor at Nuremberg. He said, security is like liberty in that many are the crimes committed in its name.
But then let me flip this, because I do think there's a lot of discontinuity here too.
Mm-hmm.
One discontinuity is leftism, liberalism, however you want to define the thing they're actually now going after. It's not communism.
Yeah.
It's not on a global march unexpectedly taking over countries. Yeah. It's not, committing espionage at the high levels of American government, because it's also not an alien force trying to alter the country from within, at least not in the eyes of much of the country. I think that they are very rapidly overreaching. It doesn't make what's about to happen not dangerous. It doesn't mean people are not going to see their lives destroyed or worse. But the Kimmel thing was a signal to me, Kimmel's suspension. Once you've defined it as Jimmy Kimmel, you've, I think, gotten pretty lost in what you're going to be able to defend. Because to most people, Jimmy Kimmel does not represent a form of left-wing radicalism. He is milquetoast network comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you begin to create a nobody is safe dynamic, which is what they want to create, but is also not a great politics. I've been thinking about this from your line when you say conservatives are often the left's best students. The former, the left, they are studying in this case. Rufo and Miller and others are studying, it was in some ways quite effective for a minute, but it's politically disastrous. It overreached almost immediately. It became a thing that Democrats had to run from. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's a difference between this era and that one, that they're on very different. They have a lot of power, but they have not slowly built a politics that can support this.
Right. I mean, you brought up the fact that there's no tie today between the domestic quote-unquote threat and a foreign threat, and that's of course true. But the flip side of that was that the Soviet Union and having to conduct the Second Red Scare in light of the Soviet Union and the kind of ideological challenge it posed throughout the globe forced the right to be careful about how it engaged in its project. You know, they're very, very careful to say, you know, it's we are defending, as Arthur Schlesinger, you know, the vital center against the extremes of both. And you had right-wing organizations on the Attorney General's list. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, despite what the movies tell us, it did help break up the Klan in the 1960s. It had to. It had to. It was just part of this global contestation, particularly in Africa and Asia. And it was discipline. That's not there anymore. Henry Farrell, the political scientist at Hopkins, has a great post that came out in the last couple of months about, you know, the thing that regimes really need to make very clear is like, we're going to reward you if you're with us, and we're going to punish you if you're against us. And you have to be really, really consistent about that. Like there's almost a proto-rule of law element in that reality. And when regimes don't do that, which, you know, I think is part of the problem that we're seeing, is that, you know, what does it take to kind of get them off your back? It's not really clear. And what's it going to take to not have people harass you and do all these things? It's not really clear. That's not always a great position for an authoritarian, proto-authoritarian regime to be in, because it means your coalition partners are going to become as uncertain as your enemies are. And so on the one hand, it does mean that the right's narrative of a kind of foreign domestic threat is a little bit murkier, but it also means it's a little bit unconstrained by that international challenge. I mean, obviously there are still international challenges to the United States, but they're not the same ideological challenges. If anything, the United States seems to following the model of other authoritarian regimes throughout the globe. So that's where I'm just uncertain.
I mean, I think we're in the most politically dangerous period of my lifetime. That's how at least I'm experiencing it.
I think the mistake I made during the first term and up until the second term, you know, just being steeped in history sometimes can be not such a great thing. You're always looking for parallels. You're looking for discontinuities and all the rest of it. But the thing is, when you actually go back to Weimar Germany, you go back, you know, the thing that you see most clearly among everybody is this is all new. We have no idea where this is going. And the historical imagination, I think today, I've been trying to disentangle myself a little bit from that and to say, you know, Trump he's his own kind of an actor.
I've become very careful about which historians or historically steeped commentators I have on, not because they're wrong, but people get very trapped in their dominant metaphor. Yeah. If what you know is Russia, this becomes Russia. If what you know is Weimar Germany, it becomes Germany. Absolutely. If what you know is fascism, it becomes fascism. And they all have light to shed, and they can all create a sense of a story that we already know how it turns out. Yeah. And we don't. And I do think your point about the disciplining force of the Soviet Union is real too. I mean, who ends McCarthyism? It's Eisenhower. And why does the Republican Party nominate Eisenhower rather than Taft? I mean, in significant part, it's that what is holding it together is the fight against communism, and Eisenhower is less of an isolationist and a much more credible figure on that. To me, though, there's also a lesson in that, which is, I mean, a lot of people challenged McCarthy and lost. You know, liberal Democrats, liberal Republicans. That what was dangerous for McCarthy was when he really abandoned the center, was going after the army and other things where people just didn't buy it anymore. And then, you know, he could be sort of pushed to the margin. Mm-hmm. And I think this is tricky. I think I'm watching people have very different reactions about politically how to respond right now. And I don't think any of us know. I think anybody who says they know is lying. But it's one of my instincts that their abandonment of free speech, their abandonment of due process, their going after people like Kimmel. I think everybody thinks it was bad for Democrats that they lost the comedians. Well, are the comedians so happy about what they see happening right now that I think they're the one place where I think people need to think very carefully about their response, and what they want to do is what kind of coalition can you build against this? Because all of a sudden, to go to something that you were saying earlier, people get very nervous. There's a lot of political power in people feeling unsettled about where they're going to stand in society and what damage can be done into them. And all of a sudden, the Trump administration is coming for a very wide swath of everyone.
Yeah.
And to what we were talking about with the Red Scare, it took a long time to build that. They're speed running this very fast.
Right. Yeah, this is the sort of the scary part of the story. The second Red Scare succeeded. Part of what deprived McCarthy of oxygen was not just that he went after the military, but that, they had really drummed out and, at the level of what their ambitions were, they had really succeeded in stopping the New Deal from where it was heading. And his electoral returns were just, it was diminishing to some degree.
What would you say the damages of the Red Scare after it had ended did to the left, did to the country, did to its government, its institutions? And what do you think that tells us about what, 4 years of the Trumpist assault on our government institutions now could do?
I think the first and most important thing was that there was a nascent, budding movement that was bringing together labor rights and civil rights, race and class, the relationship between African Americans and capitalism, that the Communist Party and left-wing front groups and just kind of left liberals were pursuing. And the second Red Scare just shut that down. And so I would say to this day, we've never really recovered from that. And we've seen that when we have these arguments that we have about race versus class. This was something that people at the forefront of those movements were thinking hard about.
Why did it shut that down? I don't quite understand it.
So there was a movement in the 1940s, well, it started in the 1930s, but in the 1940s in particular, to go into the South and start organizing the South, which was really where at that time still was the bulk of the African-American labor force. And there was a very clear understanding that if we were going to get things like national health care, which was on the agenda for the Democratic Party, even Harry Truman, and other, kind of more expansions, include African Americans in the Social Security Act, all those things that you needed to break the Solid South. You needed to, emancipate and enfranchise Black Americans. But to do that required a lot of sacrifice on the part of labor unions, on the part of white workers, on the part of white liberals, and so forth. And in order to engage in that sacrifice, you had to start making an argument about why standing up for African Americans wasn't just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. And once the second Red Scare was able to break what was called Operation Dixie, in a way, it kind of left Black Americans really on their own. Interestingly enough, actually, in the 60s, there were some people like Bayard Rustin who were always trying to repair that alliance, but it was really broken after that. So I'd say in the field, that was probably the biggest loss. I think a second one was about foreign policy. There were a group of people in the State Department who were experts on East Asia, security experts who were, on the left, were all purged. There have been a lot of historians who've made the argument that this sets the stage for the disastrous consequences with the Vietnam War, that you just, lose a whole body of institutional knowledge that has devastating consequences for the people of Vietnam and for the United States as well. The lessons, I think, for today are, as we're seeing with the purge of the government, there's a whole body of knowledge that seems to be gleefully being tossed aside when it comes to climate, when it comes to vaccines, a whole array of things. We do not know what the consequences are.
Then always a final question. What are 3 books you'd recommend to the audience?
There is a translation of a Jewish Hebrew Israeli poet, Chaim Bialik, who died many years, in the last century. He was considered the great Jewish national poet. And he wrote this poem after the Kishinev pogrom in 1903 called On the Slaughter. And Netanyahu invoked this after Gaza. But there's a translation by a wonderful translator named Peter Cole that's coming out with New York Review of Books. It's called City of Slaughter, that complicates that story and shows what a powerful poet who complicates any idea of vengeance, in particular, vengeance. So that's one book that I would really recommend. A second book is Victor Navasky's Naming Names, which is about the McCarthy era. And the reason I recommend it's about Hollywood is it really focuses on what we were just talking about, the individual and the role of individuals and the choices they make and what the ramifications are. And it's a wonderful read. It came out, I think, in 1980. And the last book is called Citizen Marx. It's an academic book. It's a study of Karl Marx by a young political theorist named Bruno Leopold, who's in Britain. And it's the Marx you never knew about. It's the Marx as a theorist of freedom who cared about things like freedom of the press passionately. His first article is about freedom of the press. And this, I think, might be of particular interest to you. Somebody who really cared about, this was a shock to me, institutional and constitutional design. He was obsessed with the Constitution of the Second French Republic and all the, the kinds of things that all of you guys, write about. There's Marx, going all in, and it's, 1850, 1851. It's not the young Marx, it's the mature Marx. So.
Corey Robin, thank you very much.
Thank you.